Thank you, Jessica. I will mention that the slides are already posted on my blog, fastwonderblog.com. So the speaking tab there has the slides. So if you want there are various links spread throughout. My talk today has 3 sections. I'm going to start by talking about the dynamics of collaboration in open source projects between individuals, companies, and communities, before moving on to talk about contribution strategies and plans. And then the last section will have some tips for being a good corporate citizen, and then we'll wrap it up with links to a few resources and a few final thoughts. Jessica did such a fabulous job of introducing me. I don't have much to say. I've done a lot of things over those 20 years. I've been a Unix system administrator. I've done a lot of data analysis. I've done, more random things than I could mention. And as Jessica mentioned, just a couple of years ago, I did go back to school and get my PhD. And I studied the Linux kernel. And I looked at how people collaborate together on Linux kernel mailing lists. Now, before we dive into talking about how your company and your employees should collaborate in open source projects, let's talk a little bit about how collaboration works within open source projects and the complex interactions that exist between individuals, companies, or employers, and communities. While there are a few exceptions, contributions to most open source projects are centered around the individual. Contributions come from individuals rather than companies. When someone submits a pull request to fix a bug, add a feature, update some documentation in an open source project, the change comes from that individual. Commits usually include a name and an email address, but in a lot of cases, unless the person uses their corporate email address, you can't even really tell where the person works. And to make this even more complicated for companies, in most open source projects, the leadership positions stay with the individual if that person changes jobs. So this means that an employee will take their leadership position in a project right with them to their next job. So companies are well served to make sure that these people are happy and well compensated. Now I can feel my lanyard rubbing against the microphone, so I'm going to take it off. Okay, I think that's better. Now on the company side, in most projects, there's no direct way for companies to participate other than by dedicating time from individual employees who contribute on behalf of that company, which is pretty common. At VMware, we have loads of people working full-time on projects like Spring, RabbitMQ, Kubernetes, a bunch of other projects. And if you aren't sure how to contribute as a company, you might be able to hire an existing contributor, or maybe even a maintainer, as an employee who can do the work on your behalf. Now, in addition to devoting time from your employees to a project, companies are also in a position to help open source projects by providing additional resources. Open source projects need funding or in-kind sponsorship for loads of things like infrastructure, legal fees. They also appreciate sponsorships for events and other activities. And I'll talk more about all of this later, since corporate involvement in open source is pretty much the main focus for this presentation. Open source communities include a wide variety of individuals who are working together within an open source project. And this includes developers, release teams, localization and translation, marketing, community managers, tech writers, users, and lots of other people who contribute to the project. Many of these people contribute as part of their day job on behalf of their employer. Others contribute in their free time. And they're both really important. And all of these people are working together as one community to accomplish a common goal, to deliver on an open source project. It's important to remember that the community or project needs have to come first. If your company has something specific that you want to contribute to an open source project, it is only going to work if that's also something that the project and the community actually wants. So individuals and companies can't force a project to take a contribution that goes against the direction of the project or isn't in the best interests of the community. it's better to find ways for your needs as a company to align with the needs of the project. And it's important to make sure that managers and leaders within your company understand this dynamic and are supporting the needs of the community when making contributions. In open source communities, I've also had loads of small world moments where people that I've worked with in past projects sort of pop up again and again in other communities that I'm part of. It's important to keep in mind that you're likely to run into these same individuals again and again. And it's important to keep in mind that you should be thoughtful and kind when working with others. If you're a big jerk in one community, it's likely that other people they'll remember this. And they'll tell people about your reputation when they're working with you in new communities, which reflects badly both on you as an individual and also on your company. And as an employer, it's worth doing a little bit of due diligence to see how someone's behaved in previous open source communities before you hire them to do work on your behalf. Part of the role of the open source program office, if you happen to have one, can be to help everyone navigate balancing what I call the triad, the individual, company, and community, through education and best practices. Now, the various groups within your organization really need to understand that they cannot just push features into open source projects, unless, again, it's also something that benefits that community and the project as a whole. When companies try to do this, it puts individual contributors into a no-win situation that can impact employee satisfaction and impacts retention. In this no-win situation, the employee cannot meet the needs of the community without jeopardizing their employment. And you really just don't want to put people into that situation. By making sure that managers and leaders actually understand this dynamic, you can make sure that your individual contributors are doing work that meets your organization's objectives while also being good corporate citizens within the community. All right, now that we've spent a little bit of time talking about how collaboration works within open source projects and companies, next up, we'll talk about how to build a contribution strategy and plans for participating in open source projects. This may sound like it doesn't have anything to do with being a good open source citizen, but having a solid open source strategy and plans are part of being a good corporate citizen because successful participation in open source requires a long-term commitment. The individuals and companies that we just talked about spend months and years building trust and reputations within specific open source projects. And all of that hard work is for nothing if those people keep getting pulled off of their open source projects to work on other things within your company. So in this section, I'll talk about how to build strategies and plans that support your business goals so that you can justify continuing to do this work over the long term. The most important part of putting together strategies and plans for your organization, or for your open source contributions, is aligning them with the overall business goals for your company. If your open source engagements don't support the overall strategies for your organization, you will drastically reduce the chance of being successful. By taking some time and effort to make sure you support the overall corporate strategy, then it's going to be much easier to justify continuing these efforts during the next planning cycle for your organization. On the other hand, when your goals are not clearly aligned with the overall strategy, people will look at the open source participation as something that can be just cut altogether or starved of resources until it sort of goes away. And this will help you make the case to senior management and company executives who are not involved in the low-level details. Explaining how your open source contributions support the goals of the company can help the exec team understand the importance of this work. I see a lot of cases where people try to explain the work that they're doing in open source and make it sound like charity, which doesn't generally go over well with executives. And so you can talk about it and put together plans and strategies that tie back to the things that your executives care about. And while some employees might see collaborating in open source to be kind of its own reward, having a solid strategy helps employees understand how the work that they do contributes to the success of the company. And as an employee, it's kind of nice to see that your work is having an impact. For many of us, our organizations use so many open source projects that it's easy to get distracted and not know where to focus. It can help to think about which open source projects are strategic in some way for your company. Maybe there are some projects that your operations team uses to run some of your critical business infrastructure. Are there development or deployment tools that impact your ability to release the products or that generate revenue for your organization? Is there other software that's important for your ability to deliver customer-facing products or services? And these questions can help you think about where to focus your open source efforts. At VMware, I curate a list of our most strategic open source projects across the entire company, and we work closely with our various business units to make sure that we have the right projects on that list. And right now, the list has 18 projects that were started at VMware, and then another 14 third-party projects. And those projects get more attention from the Open Source Program Office and from my team, focused on community strategy. And we collaborate with the project owners and stakeholders to do high-level health assessments and suggest improvements for how we can work in those projects. We also help make connections between product strategies, like the products that we sell, and open source contributions to help contributors, because we're such a big company, to help contributors who are in different business units work together and understand why a particular project is important to each of them to avoid contributors accidentally doing something that causes issues for another team and doing that in public in an open source project. For everything else, we focus on scalable efforts. So best practices, automation, Slack channel for Q&A, training, meetups with presentations and discussion time, and anything else we can think of to help make sure that our employees are doing the right thing in open source in a way that scales across the hundreds or thousands of open source projects we're involved in. Now, after you've decided which projects to support, you need to figure out how to find people who can contribute. Now, as I mentioned earlier, companies contribute to open source projects by having employees participate and collaborate in those projects. So you need to figure out how many people you need for each project, what skills are required for those people. In some cases, you might have employees with the skills already who have already contributed to open source projects in the past, which is a great starting point for new contributions. But the thing to keep in mind is that contributing to open source projects requires different skills than participating in internal projects. These people need to be comfortable in really ambiguous environments where they'll get feedback, possibly difficult or negative feedback, and be expected to respond to this feedback in the public in a professional manner. And not every engineer wants their work to be in the public spotlight, which can feel a little bit like being under a microscope sometimes. And if you don't have the skills internally, as I mentioned earlier, you might be able to find existing contributors that you can hire, but you need to be a little bit careful about this option too, because you don't want to get a reputation within an open source project for aggressively poaching employees from other companies. And it requires a bit of nuance to make it known that you're interested in hiring people to work on an open source project without aggressively pulling them away from other employers. If you make it easy for your employees to contribute, your employees are much more likely to reduce technical debt by contributing patches, bug fixes, new features back into those upstream projects where they belong. If you have too many controls and strict processes, you're probably making it a lot harder for your teams to do their work. You should think about whether your guidelines or processes help people engage in open source projects in ways that work well for your organization. While you do need to provide guidance about various things like licensing, avoiding disclosing confidential information, maybe some internal processes, this can be done in a really educational way. And my caution about guidelines and processes is that they're often written in ways that really discourage contributions, especially when they make heavy use of scary legal jargon with a focus on how you're going to punish someone when they accidentally make a mistake. And instead, you're better off writing the guidelines in ways that help engineers understand what you need them to do and why, in language that they can actually understand. At VMware, we have a pretty robust set of open source guidelines and a pretty lightweight approval process, given the size of our company, for contributing to open source projects. So before an employee contributes to a new open source project, we run those through an approval process. And that's mostly to make sure that it is indeed an actual open source project under an open source license. And then it allows our open source program office to handle anything like contributor license agreements, since we have corporate agreements with lots of people. So we can handle any other legal paperwork that's required. And this usually takes less than a day to complete the whole process. And then once that's done, you can make as many contributions to that project as you want with no more approvals. So that seems like a pretty lightweight way to do it. Now, as with any good strategy and plans, the outcome and results should be measurable so that you can tell whether your efforts were successful. Now, I love data, and this is a little weird, but measuring open source project success is actually kind of a hobby for me, and it's something I'm pretty passionate about. So I get a lot of questions about metrics. And a lot of times, the questions are focused on how do you decide what to measure as like the first step. And I think that's kind of the wrong approach. And my answer is always the same. It depends. What you measure depends on what you're trying to achieve, which is why this slide is in the strategy and planning section. Ultimately, you need to look at your strategies and plans to come up with criteria that will help you measure whether or not you're successful. So for example, if you want to improve the performance of a particular piece of open source software, counting the number of commits is not going to tell you whether you succeeded or not. You'll need to have success criteria and measurement based on specific types of performance. If you want to gain influence within an open source project, maybe you measure increases in the number of employees moving into leadership positions. And once you figure out the criteria, you need to make sure that you can get the data required to measure it and start measuring it now to get a good baseline. And there are loads of tools available to gather contribution data about open source projects. Since some of the commonly used tools can be found in the Linux Foundation's Chaos project, which is linked from this slide. And a lot of the big projects, the CNCF projects, all have dashboards using various either Chaos tools or other types of tools. And I also recommend maybe over-measuring a little bit and gathering some extra data so that if your strategy shifts in the future, you have some baseline data to start out with. But also because having some extra data can help you investigate other ideas for how you might want to improve your participation in the project. All right, now that we figured out what you want to do, let's talk about how to do it while being a good corporate citizen so that you can avoid some common but embarrassing mistakes. Each project is different, and what you need to do to join the community and participate will vary. So you want to have a close look at the project documentation, especially the contribution docs. Spend whatever time it takes to understand the contribution guidelines, codes of conduct, and other expectations for collaboration in the project. Because the expectations for contributors are different for each project. So don't assume you know how to contribute, even if you have experience with other open source software contributions. I also really recommend taking time to lurk in the community and understand how people participate. I've seen way too many overeager new community members sort of jump into the community with both feet. They make all kinds of mistakes. They violate community norms. They talk about things that aren't relevant. And they generally sort of make a mess of things. Now, everybody makes mistakes at some point, but some of them can be avoided by actually taking time to learn about the community, rather than barging in and trying to be an active participant on day one. So don't be afraid to sit back while you learn from other community members. And by taking the time to observe and lurk for a bit, you can learn about how people behave and get a feel for how people typically respond. And when you've spent some time understanding the expectations for how to contribute, you should start with something small. I've seen way too many companies spend a whole bunch of time working on huge new features internally, and then they sort of dump them into the community as one massive contribution that no one was expecting and frankly probably didn't want. And in many cases, most cases, this is just a waste of time for everyone involved, since the contribution's unlikely to be aligned with project goals or contribution expectations, and the company and employees have wasted time contributing something that's probably going to require a ton of rework at best, or possibly never be accepted at all. So you're better off starting with some small things like bug fixes to learn about the contribution process. Once you start participating, you need to expect feedback. Sometimes this feedback will be kind, other times it won't be at all. And as much as you might want to just, fire back, that's likely to reflect badly on you as an individual and on your employer. And it's better in the long run to wait to respond until you can maybe cool off just a little bit. But even when the feedback is harsh, there will be things you need to do to rework your contribution to make it acceptable. So you should try to stay focused on what changes you need to make in your contribution. And in some cases, you might need to have hard discussions with people about the merits of that contribution. But you can focus on the problem, deliver it with a bit of kindness while avoiding attacks on the other person. And it can also help to have someone else read some of your responses before you post them publicly to catch any issues that might make you sound more harsh than you think. And it's a pretty difficult line to walk sometimes, but staying professional and being kind to other people when responding to difficult feedback can make a big difference to your personal reputation and the reputation of your employer within these open source communities. In many cases, you should also expect to iterate on the feedback. After you submit your changes to accommodate the first wave of feedback, you're likely to get more feedback on those changes, so just think about it as an iterative process. And this also means that you should plan for the time it takes to get multiple waves of feedback. Submitting something at the very last minute before the release window closes and expecting it to be included in the release is just going to be frustrating to everybody involved. So give yourself plenty of time for multiple feedback and resubmit processes. After you get past those first few small contributions, you want to make sure that you spend time discussing proposed changes in the community before you make them. By talking about contributions very early in the process, you can get feedback on ways to architect the changes so that they'll be consistent with the expectations of the project. You can also learn about anybody else who might be working in similar areas to hopefully avoid conflicting changes that won't work together when they get merged. And these discussions also avoid surprising people, especially for new features or other really big changes. It can also help to break those big changes into several smaller, easier to digest contributions. It's a lot easier for maintainers to find the time to provide feedback on small contributions, and it gives you time to make corrections if anything that you're doing maybe isn't quite right. And this allows you to iterate on the feedback through several contributions, making it less likely to have bigger, more fundamental issues. It's also important to keep in mind that you don't have any control over other participants in the project. This is different from working within a company where you can escalate issues to managers who can work to resolve issues with non-responsive employees. In open source projects, you don't have a strict chain of command or other ways to exert control over the people you collaborate with. Instead, you should strive to be kind and easy to work with, since you may need to find other ways to influence people to respond to your patches or your pull requests. A lot of the work that we do in open source projects is based on the relationships we have with other people. So I mentioned before my PhD research was based on collaboration in the Linux kernel. And as part of that research, before I did the mailing list analysis, I interviewed a bunch of kernel developers. And in all of the interviews, they talked about the importance of their relationships with other people. Almost all of them talked about how existing relationships made it easier to collaborate with others. All of the people I interviewed mentioned in-person collaboration at conferences and other meetings as something that was important, which is why I'm happy to have them back in person again. But people talked about how it was sometimes easier to work through those really big, difficult issues at conferences where you could just talk to people and talk through some of the issues. It's also easier to communicate with someone online if you've met them in person. and maybe shared a meal or a drink or just had a nice conversation with them at an event. Because knowing the human being on the other side of that keyboard can really make a much bigger difference than you might realize. Now, if your employees are working on open source projects, you really should see if there are any conferences where large numbers of other community members attend. By having some key employees attend those conferences, they can build deeper, lasting relationships with other people that will benefit your company and your employees. I've spent a lot of time, an embarrassing amount of time probably, at open source conferences over the years. And I have really deep and lasting connections with the people that I've met at those events. And now, when I need to do something new or have a question, I usually know somebody who can point me in the right direction. And I often make introductions for other employees to people outside of the company who can help us learn something new or solve some tricky issue. Upstreaming your patches helps you become a good corporate citizen. But it also has loads of internal benefits for your company. When you maintain patches internally, every time the open source project releases fixes or other updates, you need to go through the work of reapplying your patches and possibly rewriting some of your code if they happen to touch the same bits that were changed in the update. The side effect of this sometimes difficult process is that people tend to just put off applying those updates, which can be a really big problem if those updates contain security fixes, which they probably do. And while it takes more time up front, you're better off taking the time to submit these patches into the project where they can be properly maintained and where other people can benefit from them as well. And the easier you can make it for your employees to contribute those changes back into open source projects, the better off you'll be. And in general, upstreaming patches is sort of considered the right thing to do in open source projects, which helps maintain your company's status as a good corporate citizen. Understanding maintenance expectations is also a big part of being a good corporate citizen. Putting large chunks of code into an open source project, disappearing and expecting someone else to maintain it reflects very poorly on your organization. Now, if you fix a small bug or make some minor changes, you won't be expected to maintain those because someone else is likely responsible for maintaining that thing that you fixed or tweaked. But where you really need to think about this is when you're making large contributions, like a new feature or a new driver or a new module of some sort. And you need to make sure that your employees are planning to maintain that code over the long term before you contribute it into an open source project. Now, if you want to open source a project because it has no users, it's old, it's crusty, and you don't want to maintain it anymore, please don't do that. Dumping your project into the open source community and hoping that someone else will be just dying to take over this dead project that no one wants is, at best, a little bit naive and generally just makes your company look bad. So make sure that you're open sourcing projects for the right reasons. For example, a desire to collaborate with other people and innovate on a project is a good reason to open source it. If a project will need to integrate with a whole bunch of other technologies, open sourcing it will make it easier for people to help you integrate it with technologies that maybe you're less familiar with. And your company needs to be prepared to maintain that project over the long term, just like you would with something that you released under a proprietary license. And this takes time and resources, so you need to plan for that. Now, where I see companies underestimate the amount of effort required is usually related to the time it takes to collaborate with the community. You need to have people available to answer questions, discuss new features, provide feedback on new contributions. Now, every company I've ever worked for has struggled at one point or another to manage incoming pull requests for open source projects, since it takes a lot of time to evaluate those contributions and provide feedback. And the people working on those pull requests really need to be comfortable providing tough feedback. Because the reality is that some pull requests will contain poor quality code, or possibly never be merged because of some maybe fundamental conflict with the direction of the project. And it's easy to ignore these and hope they'll go away. They won't, and a pile of neglected pull requests just makes you look like a bad corporate citizen. And it's important that employees respond to these in a way that's clear about the future of the contribution, but also shows empathy and appreciation for the hard work that someone put into that contribution. And while it's tough and not always entirely realistic, keeping up with pull requests shows that you care about the community and helps you with your good corporate citizen standing. Before I wrap up, let me leave you with a few resources you might find useful. The To-Do group has a bunch of guides with great info about all aspects of how companies work within open source projects. The CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group has a governance working group and a contributor growth working group, which provide templates and guidance about things like contributor experience, governance, openness, to help people develop strategies for maintaining healthy projects. The Open Source Way Guidebook is a fantastic resource with loads of details about building and maintaining open source projects. And these are all really great starting places for understanding best practices for open source projects. The work that we do within open source communities is in the public, and it's highly visible. Other contributors and the press will talk about our behavior and our participation, which can reflect positively or negatively on our organization's brand. So being a good corporate citizen within open source projects allows us to help make sure that our participation has a positive impact on our company and our company's brand. With that, thank you for coming to my talk, and we can open it up for questions.